everybody, and welcome back. Thanks for tuning in to another video here. My name is Dominic. I'm the host of the Android Factory. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. We're not really going to be writing code. Instead, we're going to be evaluating something that I've built out here that's a very powerful paradigm known as a server-driven UI or a backend-driven UI. For simplicity, we're using Firebase's real-time database instead of actually spinning up a backend, but we can accomplish the same thing, so no big deal. As we get started here, I just want to quickly demo what we've actually figured out here. As we can see on the emulator, basically just a little bit of a list view here that we can scroll through. We have some different favorite status here. Basically imagine maybe it's like a news feed or something. Obviously the content is kind of whatever, but more importantly here we have some meta information, can favorite true, mode layout 1. And if we go ahead and change this to layout 2 and hit enter, we'll see in real time this application updates to a completely different view. It's not completely different, but it is a grid layout, that has now 2 columns here. If we want to go ahead and go into our layout file, and we can go ahead or layout section of the JSON, and we change columns to 3, now we can see there are 3. The UI starts to break a tiny bit here, but you can start to see the power here of just modifying some things in Firebase. Let's flip back here to layout 1 so that we get that nice view there that we see, and then we can even change something here, can favorite from true to false, and we'll see that the emulator now no longer have those heart icons, you no longer have the functionality to favorite things. And while this is a simple example, it does drive the point home about just how powerful this server-driven UI can actually be. You can obviously build out a much more complicated application with a lot more functionality, and you can really build some pretty spectacular things. So as we get started here, as we start to dive in through the different information that we have here in Firebase and the code behind it all, go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe if you are brand new, and let's just go ahead and get after it. So as we can see here, we have a UI, like main node, let's call it. Then we have this meta information that kind of, drives home how the actual screen is going to work here. We have mode layout 1, can favorite. We saw how that works. Inside of our layout tag here, we have the different layout options, right? We can continuously add, however many different layout options we want. And within each layout option here, we have a type. This one is list. We have a type. This one is grid. And, the grid one has some additional information, the number of columns. Maybe there are other layouts that you want to have, that have additional information or unique information. You can go ahead and do that. So we kind of have our meta information, mode layout 1, that points to this information. The type is list. The code interprets that as such, and we get this list view. So you can kind of see how it starts to roll together. And then eventually the data here, nothing too fancy, right? We just have some kind of lorem ipsum stuff, but we have a title, we have a description, an ID, and then it is favorite status here, true, false to kind of denote, the status if this was set to true. So that's basically about it, but I think the most important thing to note here is that there is a difference between the data, the actual information that's being displayed on screen, and the layout information. You could embed and kind of intertwine this information, couple it a lot closer to one another, but keeping it separate here allows you to kind of manipulate each one independently, whether the layout information or the data information, to kind of accomplish the UI that you want. But that's about it here. Nothing too fancy in the real-time database. Go ahead and flip over to the code here. We'll see we have a main activity, and realistically all this is done in a main activity and a view model. I made the view model just for good measure, but you could probably do this all inside of one composable if you really wanted to. As we walk through it here, not really going to care too much about architecture and those kinds of things, or how to actually set up Firebase and all that kind of stuff. So this tutorial is more so about the server-driven concept, as opposed to the ins and outs of Firebase and things of that nature. If you want some content on that, let me know in the description. More than happy to walk through it. But basically inside of our onCreate here, we have that standard theme, surface, and then we have our main composable. And that's about it, so that's all we really need from there. Inside of our main composable, we'll see here that we have access to our main activity view model. That is where all of our data comes from. And as we can see here, we have our layout information by view model, collecting it from a flow with the lifecycle aware for this composable here. So kind of just what you would expect, right? But then underneath here, pretty simply, when our layout information is null, we have a little bit of a loading component, and when we have something here, we go ahead and basically just populate that information in to this newsfeed screen composable. We have some sealed classes and or one sealed class or sealed interface and a couple data classes to make it work. But we'll see here we're starting to translate that information inside of Firebase to something in the code. So we have a sealed interface here called layout type. We see that we have a list, which is of type layout type, and then we also have a grid of type layout type, and it has some information there, right? It has columns. In this case, maybe in other layout types, you want to have specific information to help you build the UI. Great. A data class here can allow you to do that, and now we know, all right, list doesn't really need anything else. Maybe if you wanted to add in padding or dynamically allocate the spacing in between items, we could very easily do that by just adding in some information here. But in this case, we kept it simple, and then our grid, we have some additional info that gives us that flexibility between 2, 3, however many columns you want. Then we're going to go ahead and take a look at this class here. So I just called it layout meta. That is comprised of a layout type and a Boolean for if the favorite is enabled, right? So now we're starting to capture the overall screen information, or not screen information, the overall layout information, right? So this is going to be list or grid, and then true or false if our favorites are enabled. And then that couples with our layout information really nicely, because then this is basically our screen data, right? This is the info that runs our entire screen. We have the layout meta, which tells us what type and if the favorite functionality should be there or not. And then we have the connection with our data here. And this is a list of these news items that we have, and that's how we actually get information on the screen. Again, we need that data information and we need that layout information as well to actually, make this very dynamic. So this final class here is really what the UI deals with. And if we remember up here, right, when we are in the non-null state, we feed it into our newsfeed screen, which is the composable here that basically is what you see in the UI. So we have our layout information, we have all of the layout meta, we have all of the data that we actually need, and then we can very easily here just manage the different types, right? We see that when the layout information .layout meta .layout type is a list, we do this. When it is a grid, we do that. And, thanks to Compose, this implementation is very straightforward, right? A list here, we're using a lazy column. We're setting some padding here, we're setting some vertical arrangement, and then we have our items. In the grid implementation, we're doing something very similar. We have the lazy vertical grid. It has the columns here that are coming from Firebase. It is that dynamic information. And then we have our padding and our vertical and horizontal arrangement, but then we also just have our items displayed down here. Now, also, we love Compose because we can make the news item component composable down here, which is, the actual stuff that you see on the screen. So that's our column that has our row in here that optionally will have, if our favorite is enabled, we will then see the heart icon at the end of that row, otherwise we won't. And then we just see some other information here, spacers and text to kind of get the UI into the state that it is, make it look like something you would expect. So not really caring too much about the UI here. We're more so caring about the server-side implementation kind of concept, but that's basically it, right? We have one component that we actually use in both cases, and Compose allows that component to wrap appropriately. The text doesn't go off the screen and all that really wonderful, wonderful things. And basically, depending upon our layout type, we either put that in a column or we put that in a grid, and we reuse that news item component here. And that's basically about it, actually. This is the whole UI kind of side of things. Loading component, very straightforward, not really going to go through that. It's just a little loading wheel. It doesn't even come up on the screen, actually, because things happen so fast. But that's really the concept here, right? We have our view model, we get our layout information, and then this newsfeed screen can decipher exactly what it should do, at these different moments based on the layout type. So we're going to jump over to the view model here to kind of see how we actually get the data, how we actually turn that into a flow that we can collect as state with lifecycle. But let me know in the comments down below what you think of this. If it is something new for you, if it's a little too complex for you, whatever the case is, I'm happy to explain a little bit more here. We're going to dive into the data side of things. So pretty straightforward here, just an implementation to get our real-time database. Once you import the correct things, firebase.database gives you the node, or it gives you access to that whole database. Then we have our data, layout, and meta nodes. We kind of do the exact same thing. We get references to specific locations inside of our database, which is really just represented as a JSON file. So if we see here, let's see if hopefully that's on the screen at both times, right? We have a get reference UI/data, UI/layout, UI/meta, and then we'll see inside of the Firebase that that information is kind of replicated there as well. So we can listen for each individual node here, any changes that end up happening, all the data that we want to get, etc., right? And we can then kind of combine all that information to get that final layout information class so that we can then go ahead and display everything on screen. So we have a couple models here that just data classes that represent the information, how it's structured in Firebase here. So the news item is the one that has the actual content, right? We have the ID, title, description is favorite. That's what we see on the emulator here. And the meta is also pretty straightforward. It has that mode that's a string, and then it has can favorite, which is a Boolean, right? And then that kind of gets combined down the road to actually come up with the info that we need. So then we have this concept here of Firebase flows and UI flows. This is basically, your network connectivity, right? We're going to get all of the data, in this case as well via Firebase. We're actually listening to real-time updates, which is why that demo in the beginning of the video was so helpful. But we're basically getting all of our network information. And then here we have that UI flow, which is what gets observed at the composable level and actually gets, to drawing everything on screen here. So if we see the layout information flow, we have a state flow of layout information. This is where that nullable comes into play because we're not really handling, or we're using null to handle loading states. We combine a variety of flows here to actually get us the information that we need. In the case our news feed information is empty, right? That comes from this data flow that listens over here. We'll cover that in a minute, listens to that node that exists in Firebase. So if that's empty for some reason, we return null. That'll show a loading spinner on the screen, all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, here we have some information once we have our news items that we're then able to get, we're able to combine the information that we have for the layout meta information and then eventually the layout information that we display or that we use to display to the user. We'll revisit this in a minute once we get through these Firebase flows because this is where all the data comes from. So each one of these flows here is set as a callback flow, basically a really nice way to wrap callback pattern. That's the word I was looking for. So we can go ahead, all of these flows follow the same concept here. We declare a listener for a particular node, then we go ahead and add that event listener on a node, and then we have our await close so that we can remove that, just cleaning things up. Good practice to kind of do all that stuff. As a brief overview here, we basically can subscribe to particular nodes, and then the onDataChanged function will get called, and this snapshot here will represent the information at the node you're listening for. So here we have our news items. We can iterate through our children. We can map them over to a particular news item. And then unfortunately, I had to do some janky stuff here to actually get the is favorite Boolean working. I was having trouble with this. Let's see here. I was having trouble with this information being set as a Boolean here for false as opposed to a string here for false. So I don't know. It was probably just my fault. But anyway, that's why this is a little bit longer, probably a little bit more disgusting to look at. But point is, all we're doing inside of this section here is just listening to what's in Firebase and creating a list of news items, our domain item here, which is this data class here, a list of this data class so that we can then emit that to the flow so that then the flow combine that we were just looking at below actually starts to work. So that's the concept here, right? We basically just have a callback flow declared. We then attach a listener to the data node. We send some information up. We're not worrying about the uncanceled route. And for all this other information, the layout type and the meta type as well, it is all the same stuff. We had to have an additional function here to help us parse list versus grid because we're doing a little bit of dynamic or differing parsing here. But this is all just implementation details. Don't worry about this. Here we have our listener again that we just go ahead and map our children down from that snapshot into this map of string comma layout type. And basically what that ends up resulting in is this right here, where we would have a map that looks like layout 1, and then it would map to list, and layout 2, it would map to grid, but it is mapping to our layout type class, which was that sealed interface here. So we basically have string to list right here, and then string to grid, which has our column information. All right, so that's all that we end up doing here at this level, so that we can end up pushing out a flow of string comma layout type. And then lastly here, our meta, which is just a flow of meta, which is this information right here, is really the same thing, except this is the most simple implementation because we are just simply getting the snapshot, and we're then basically just saying get value, which more or less converts the value into this information, into this structure here. So as we can see here, we have Ken favorite and mode, set as a Boolean, set as a string. And if we flip over here, meta, this is the key, and then this is the value, right? All this information here. So the Ken favorite is a Boolean, the mode is a string. So we can just very simply, basically map that information over. Then we emit that to the flow. So now we have our meta information here, the Ken favorite and the mode. We then have our map of string to layout type, and we have our list of items that we're displaying on screen. Now we have all these flows set up. They're all private val. We'll make that a val. They're all private vals because of course. And then here the UI flow just combines all that information, right? So we have the list of news items. We have our map of string to layout type, and then we have our overarching Ken favorite and mode information as well. So we'll see that we kind of start putting that together here. Our layout type we end up looking up in the map, right? So this would be meta.node is going to say layout 1, and then we have a map representation of this. So then we can just ask this map, hey, give me the layout type for layout 1. That happens to be list. Perfect. We kind of stuff that in here. Then we have our favorite enabled is just simply meta.kenFavorite, which comes from this line of JSON right here. And then we just put that information into our layout information class, which has the basically the layout info and the data corresponding to it. And that's it. We just go ahead and observe this information here. We then eventually get a properly formed layout information, and then we just stuff that into our news feed screen here. So, as one more little demo here, we can go ahead and play around with some things. We can change it over to mode layout 2, which is now our grid mode, right? Because it maps to this information here. We can go ahead and change our columns. We could change them all the way down to 1 if you want, right? And then it just looks like an actual list here, so you can kind of do some funny stuff like that, but at least 2 kind of makes the most sense here. We see the heart icons on the side of the titles here. We can go ahead and quickly turn those off by doing false, and boom, we kind of have all the power here, which is wonderful. We don't have to deploy any additional code. We don't have to update the application. Obviously if we changed and added in another layout type or something like that, we would not know how to handle that. Let me show you something, what I mean by that very quickly here. Inside of the layout type, we are parsing the information, and we're basically saying, when the type says list, we return the layout type list. When it is grid, we return layout type.grid, and the columns come from the information, right? So it's going to come from this line of the JSON as well. This is all just how you parse that information, converting it to an int, non-null, etc., etc. But we have our else block here, the unknown type. We can map, we can go ahead and say the type, and then we also return the layout type dot list. So if we put something in here that was just like my crazy layout, nice, we crashed the app. Yeah, we seem to be crashing the app here because we are non-null asserting. So I think realistically, if we went layout type dot list here, which is our default, then we are probably all good here, which is great. Sorry about that little live demo. I guess I never tested that edge case, but point is, we were asking a map for the information. Obviously the my crazy layout did not exist in the map that we've built here. So we, clearly hit a runtime error. That's on me, but it was very easy to fix, right? So then we can always change this back to layout 2. That sets us up to be at a grid here. And then if we go ahead and try that again, my crazy layout, it will then default here, right? It didn't know what it was, but we're not crashing anymore. We know that we're going to default to list or whatever we kind of want to declare as our default. So we'll go ahead and just change this back to layout 1 because why not? It's not going to change anything on screen. And yeah, that is about it, folks. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for following along. If you made it this far in the video, smash the like button. Subscribe if you are brand new. Let me know if this was interesting to you. Let me know if you want to see more of this or a deeper explanation of real-time coding for this kind of thing. Firebase is extremely powerful, and this is one way that we can leverage it. I hope it made sense. If it didn't, reach out in the comments. I'm happy to explain further. And thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.